Hello. A tradition that I love is the ghost story at Christmas, and as you probably know, I also love the world of Warhammer. So I thought it might be fun for me to tell an original chiller set in the Warhammer old world. Gather your loved ones around the fire, grab a drink of something warm, and probably best not to light any candles. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and tonight, this is my Warhammer ghost story for Christmas. The Tallow Man. A thin wisp of smoke curled away from the instantly snubbed candle. No candles after dark tonight, you know the rule, Priska said, as with practiced ease she heaved her daughter up from the kitchen table and into her arms. But I don't like the dark, appealed Sabine, as her mother carried her up the crooked and irregular stairs. I know, darling, but we can't afford to light the candles every night just because we want to. There's a long and hard winter ahead, and we must make the most of every flame. That's not the reason, came Peter's voice from the bed in the corner of the small upstairs room. With a sing-song inflection, he continued, "No candles tonight, 'cause the Tallow Man's bite." Don't tease your sister, Peter. She's too young to know when you're telling silly stories, Priska chastised as she lay the young Sabine down in her bed. I'm not too young. I'm 5 years old, and I know all about the Tallow Man. The Prim brothers said their uncle saw it last year when he was delivering grain to Middenheim. Priska stood between the two children in their small, threadbare beds, knowing that it was going to get cold tonight. The light of Mondstille entered through the one cracked window, but at times it felt like this ramshackle home with its odd corners and mismatched panels rejected light rather than kept it in. Shadows impossibly cast from every angle. Perhaps they would be best all sleeping in the same room tonight, to keep warm, and to stay safe. I wouldn't believe everything that Wolfgang and Otto Prim tell you, Sabi. Those boys have wicked tongues, and minds more wicked still. Peter interjected again, looking up from the small sheaf of paper he had been concentrating on. Why don't you tell us the true tale of the Tallow Man then, Mother? I've heard you and Father mention him before. Priska regarded her young son. Although he looked quite like her, he had already taken on many more aspects of his father, learning to read quickly and taking an interest in the old, the arcane, and the magical. With Irmgard, Priska had already had many conversations about enrolling the boy in one of the imperial colleges in Altdorf, but they both knew that this was likely nothing more than a dream. Even a boy as gifted as Peter could only become an apprentice with sponsorship, and it was not cheap living in the capital. Very well. You will both tell me what you have heard of this Tallow Man, and then I will share what I know to be true. At this, Peter and Sabine each sat up a little in their beds, excitement clearly visible on their faces, before she continued, but only after your father is home. And with that, the excitement quickly drained and both children collapsed back onto their beds with a low drone of disappointment. To the children, this was far from a fair deal, seeing as their father Irmgard worked for a banker high in the city, and it took him many hours to travel to their home, far from the bridges and walls on the rock. Priska was a woodswoman by trade, used to the biting winds and harsh conditions of the Empire's forests, but she had always sought to provide a warm and comfortable home for her family. Irmgard could not be more her opposite in outlook or form. She was tall and strong, with shoulders perfectly capable of swinging her mighty axe as long as any felling might take. Irmgard, meanwhile, was thin, desperately thin, pale and short, made shorter still by his tendency to hunch his shoulders and lean forward, a likely side effect of a lifetime spent filling in ledgers and consulting vast tomes. It could just as likely be a product, though, of spending so much time living in a house with a ceiling as low and curiously angled as theirs, something she hoped would not affect Peter or Sabi when they grew up. For much of the year, Priska stayed encamped at the sawmills, working as many hours as there was light in the day, to save up and to send home as much coin as she could. As the cold and the snow took hold, and the winter solstice approached, it became too dark and too dangerous for the camps to remain in the Drakwold, and there would be several months without work, during which Priska always returned home to be with her family. The two embraced, taking that cold that one another felt and replacing it with the warmth and love that they shared still, even after the many hardships and much bitter toil that filled their days. Irmgard, you're so cold, as if you've been touched by a white. Get to the fire and warm yourself before it burns out completely, and fill your belly. There is soup left and some of the bread is still good. Irmgard put down his satchel carefully, and did as his wife told him, keeping his coat on whilst he desperately tried to warm himself up. "How are the children? Are they to bed?" he asked, as he felt the soup begin to heat him pleasantly from within. "Peter is working on some story or other, making good use of the charcoal you got him. I just wish I could read what he has written." "We will have him read it to us, darling, when it is done. Oh, and I was able to take some more scraps of paper from Sicken's office, discarded and torn pieces that will not be missed. They will make for a perfect gift for Peter come Mondstille. How is Sarbi this evening? I'm sure she's anxious with the nights growing darker." Priska sighed, knowing the conversation that was likely to follow. "She is worried. She would have us light a candle." "What did you say to her?" asked Irmgard. "The truth, that we cannot afford to burn the few candles that we have left. And that—" Priska paused, unsure what to say next. "Ah," understood Irmgard. "I imagine there has been talk of the Tallow Man this evening." Priska replied honestly. "Sarbi has heard of it from those foolish boys the Prims, and Peter seems to know something of it already, though I've no idea from where. They've asked me to tell them the truth, such as I understand it. There's no harm in a little superstition, darling, and if a fairy tale makes them less likely to burn candles when there's no need, then I am all for it. It is no mere fairy tale, Irmgard. It is real, and it should be guarded against seriously." Irmgard couldn't help letting the derision infect his voice as he proclaimed, "I hear constantly of the acts of the gods. Everyone who comes to make a claim on Mr. Sickens tells of demons and devils and curses, but they are all as likely liars as anything else. How can we believe in the acts of the dark gods when the gods of light and law do nothing and show themselves to us not at all? If Sigmar or Tal or Ulrich really did exist, then why would they allow to happen the things that we've seen happen? Why would they let orcs destroy the Schelsberg's farm, or let my sister suffer the way she did?" Without realizing it, Irmgard had risen from his seat, his passion giving heat to his words and to his body. After a moment, he remembered himself, and sat back down to his soup, taking his coat off now as his temperature had risen somewhat. Having heard these words before, Priska was in no mood to engage in another theological debate with the man that she loved, but who sometimes she simply couldn't understand. "I have no answer to that. But I do know what I have seen in the forests. Mutated men given unholy, beastly forms, the clear work of nefarious powers, or the murderous spirits released from forgotten cairns disturbed in passing. 3 men died to such a simple mistake. I know for certain that there are things way beyond the city walls that cannot be explained in your contracts and your numbers, Irmgard. And I will be damned by Sigmar if I don't prepare our children for what is out there in the world." If Irmgard hadn't realized before that bringing up this seemingly endless argument was a foolish decision, then he soon would, though not quickly enough to stop himself from compounding his own mistake. In entreaty, he said, "Let us forget such silly stories and seek solace in our home and our family tonight. In fact, I have a surprise from old Mr. Sickens." Before he could finish his sentence, Priska stood and made for the stairs. "Unless Sickens has gifted you a crown of reason, or else paid off the debt of back pay he owes you, then I don't want to hear it. Finish your soup and come up to bed, before you catch your death of cold. I'm going to tell our children a silly story that might just keep them alive one day." And with that, Priska ascended the crooked staircase once more, and left Irmgard in the dim light of the guttering fireplace, alone with his soup. From the children's room, Priska heard a sound, a scuffle, and then a thud. She opened the door quickly and caught the source of the disturbance. Peter and Sarbi were throwing their solstice fruits back and forth across the room. "Settle down, both of you," shouted Priska more loudly than she had intended, her frustration with Irmgard getting the better of her. Both children seemed cowed at the unexpectedly severe response to their simple game, and Priska instantly regretted her tone. Okay. Peter, come over here and get under the covers next to Sabi. We're going to talk about the Tallow Man." Peter was excited that he was finally going to hear this story, and so all was immediately forgiven. He dashed over to his sister's bed and dove onto it next to Sabine as she tried to stay warm. "Calm down. Okay, everybody comfortable?" asked Priska as she sat on the edge of the bed alongside her children. The terrible cold outside was creeping in, so staying close together would be best for everyone, thought Priska. Though, from Sabine's bed, the moonlight shadows stretched deep into the center of the room, and it gave her an odd feeling. She didn't like not being able to see clearly into the corners that surrounded her. But before she did anything about that, Sabi asked, "Is the Tallow Man real?" Clearly keen to find out if the Prims had lied to her. "Why don't you tell me what you've heard about the Tallow Man, and then I will tell you which parts are true and which parts are not," said Priska, knowing that Sabi liked nothing more than to tell everyone everything she had learned on any given day. "Well, I've heard that the Tallow Man is a demon, and that he comes at night, and that he has long fingers made of hard wax with flames for fingertips, and that he wants to eat little children who have been naughty." Sabine shuddered as she said this, looking to her mother for comfort, and finding there a warm, loving expression which made her feel safe again almost immediately. Peter quietly scoffed and cleared his throat dramatically before beginning his version of the story. "The Tallow Man was a great sorcerer called Talossus, maybe the greatest that the colleges have ever seen, but he was expelled for experimenting with dangerous new magics. You see, he didn't want to be just a bright wizard or a member of the Jade Order or Amethyst. He read the older books, the sacred ones, kept secret and safe, the ones about demonology and necromancy. But he didn't want to be tied to one of those disciplines either. Talossus wanted to command the entire spectrum of magic, for the winds to flow through him and do his bidding. So after he was banished by the Supreme Patriarch, he went on a quest to find the power for himself, experimenting with dark arts. He became corrupted by his obsession, and his face began to reflect the blackness of his heart. His skin started to bubble and droop as though it had been melted by a great heat, and his back became cracked and bent so that he could only shuffle around. But the cost was worth it to him, because eventually he found the power he sought in the pages of an ancient grimoire, a book he uncovered buried beneath a warped little house just like ours." At these words, Peter paused and looked at his sister, who had again grown nervous as he told his story. His mother gave him a disappointed look, which he chose to ignore, preferring to indulge in the power he was enjoying from playfully scaring little Sabi. "The book allowed Talossus to steal the magic of other wizards, drawing out their life essence and turning them into statues of solid wax. Talossus would melt down the waxy remains of his victims and mold little candles from them, giving them as gifts to unsuspected strangers for his own amusement. The wizards from the colleges are still searching for Talossus, and all they know is that he likes to hide in small, dark rooms, under the bed." And with that, Peter made a great growling noise, and Sabine finally broke into the scream that had been building at the back of her throat the entire time her brother spoke. It took Priska more than a few moments to calm her daughter's fear and her son's laughter. She should have known Peter wouldn't miss an opportunity to let his impish sense of humor take flight. When at last silence returned to the darkened room, Priska began her own story. "Be still, children, and I will tell you what I know to be true of the so-called Tallow Man. I tell you this not to frighten you, but to protect you. You see, you were both in part correct. There is a being known as the Tallow Man, and he does take children, but he is not a demon, nor is he even a man any longer. It is a spectre, brought forth by ruinous magics to wreak havoc on the good folk of the Empire, and it is the most powerful on the 12th night of Mondstille. the winter solstice, when night and day share the sky. Peter shifted a little under the thin blanket, perhaps only trying to keep warm, but just as likely due to a fearful realization. He said to his mother, "Tonight is the 12th night." "Yes, it is," she said back. "This night is when the Tallow Man walks the streets most brazenly, stealing children from their parents and leaving no witnesses to tell the tale. If the Prim brothers' uncle had seen it, then he would not have returned home to speak a word of it. This spirit is a malevolent one, seeking to inflict great pain on the living, for it was once a man too, and it hates that we still possess that which it does not. Life. When it walked the world of the living, this man was a chandler, making tallow candles of the cheapest and most rancid materials. Only the poorest of people would buy these candles, for they were badly made and did not last long. And worst of all, when they burned, they gave off a billowing, smoky stench that would fill a house with rotten darkness. What he lacked in skill, he more than made up for in envy. The man was jealous of his more successful rivals, those who produced cleaner and better candles from finer ingredients. But it was of his brother that he was most envious. He had perfected a blend of beeswax and aromatic herbs that the priests of Ulrich had embraced in their rituals, and he had become wealthy beyond compare. The man's bitterness gave rise to a scheme, concocted in the back alleys of Middenheim, with a putrid and evil wizard. He was given an insidious tincture that was to be poured into the molten wax of his brother's next batch of candles, one that would wholly corrupt them, and which would cast a murderous pall on the temples in which they were burned. But the man's brother was no fool, and he knew of the envy and bitterness and cruelty that was cast against him. On the night that the man enacted his terrible plot, he was almost caught, surrounded at the very moment he poured the liquid into the wax. In the terrible struggle that followed, the man and the building were engulfed in a great conflagration, burned to cinders, with nary a trace left behind. The wind outside the children's bedroom had begun to rise further, and there was a chilling howl as it buffeted the slight glass. Priska knew that her story was doing just as much to chill her children as the wind might, but she also felt that they should know the truth of the world they lived in, and how dangerous even the most innocuous of acts, like lighting a candle, really could be. After a moment's respite, she carried on her tale. That all happened a great many years ago, on the night of the winter solstice, and every year since the Tallow Man has returned to seek vengeance. At first, it was his brother's family who bore the brunt of this spectral curse. Nephews and nieces disappeared in the night, no sign of what had taken them or how. With each passing year, more precautions were taken. Children were locked in sealed rooms and guarded. But still, they were gone. Families sought refuge in the temples of Ulrich, and whole congregations would be lost by morning. Eventually it became clear. The rooms, the temples, the people, they all held candles, and that light had shown the Tallow Man how to find them. It was only in darkness that one would be safe when the Tallow Man was abroad. Sabine tried to say something, but her throat was dry, and at first only a croak emerged. "Is that why we cannot light a candle tonight? Because the Tallow Man would find us?" With a smile full of love, and a voice that expressed how grateful she was that her daughter understood, Priska said, "That's right, little one. Now that he has been starved of the family of his brother, the victim that he wants most, the Tallow Man will seek out anyone in Middenheim foolish enough to light a candle and call to him." Priska sat with her back to the closed bedroom door, looking at her children before her on the bed. A footstep on the stairs elicited a creak in the wood, and she felt confident that Irmgard was finally coming up to bed. Even though they had parted in disquiet, she would be glad to have him here by her side, her family together on this dangerous night. There were more creaks and cracks as the stairs uttered their usual protests. The door behind Priska slowly swung open, and it was only then that she became flooded with fear. The faces of her children both became contorted in terror, and worse, they were illuminated by the light cast by a flickering flame. As Priska spun round, she saw her husband holding a small bent candle with a lit flame atop it. Innocently, he said, "Look at what Mr. Sickens gave me, a gift for my hard work, and a promise that he would pay me the wages he owes me soon." In mere seconds, Priska darted for the candle in her husband's hand and snuffed it out, casting it to the floor. "You fool!" she yelled, carrying her momentum forward and past him through the doorway. "Stay with the children and keep them safe. I need to get my axe." Irmgard looked utterly dumbstruck, but when he glanced at Peter and Sabi, he could see how terrified they were, and his instincts to protect them took over. He knelt down next to the bed and gathered them both in his arms. Priska, meanwhile, lost no time in racing down the stairs, taking 3 at a time in great bounds. She crossed the ground quickly and reached for her axe, held on the wall above the stove with the open fire beneath it. The fire was all but dulled, with only a few small chunks of coal retaining their glow and warmth. It was dark in the kitchen, with light of neither moon reaching to this side of the house. Before she could look around, Priska heard a sound that filled her with utter, incomprehensible dread. She could hear her family screaming. She made her way back up the stairs faster even than she had descended them, but whatever had happened in the room was over by the time she entered it again. The beds were empty, and there was no sign of Sabine, Peter, or Irmgard. It was as if they had been plucked from the world and spirited away in an instant. Priska knew that they were not in the house any longer, but to stop herself from breaking down, she searched every room, opened every door, and probed every shadow, all before returning to the children's bedroom and falling to the floor to weep. As she looked again at the bed where her family had been just moments before, she was filled with immense, unquantifiable sadness. And then, after casting her eyes downward and catching sight of something, that sadness turned to sheer bloody rage. On the floor lay the small candle that her husband had lit, the gift given to him by someone who should have known better, someone who probably did. But that didn't matter now, for Priska knew what she must do. Grabbing her axe from the floor beside her and scooping up the candle, she walked to the kitchen stove with purpose, thrusting the candle into the remnants of the fire. It took a few moments, but eventually the wick caught and the small candle was lit. It cast a paltry light into the room, barely brightening her surroundings. But Priska did not care. She held it aloft and shouted to the night, "I know you see me, Tallow Man. Come and find me by the light." All was still. Priska stood in place like stone, her muscles tensed and ready to act. As she surveyed the room, she peered into each dark corner in turn. The weak candle light did not cross to the furthest reaches, leaving only impenetrable black voids into which Priska would lose herself if she stared for too long. And then, in one corner at the back of the house, she thought she saw a shape. It was as if a small mound was unfurling, like a child sat balled up on the floor and then rose to standing. No, not a child. This shape was far too tall for that. If it were a man, then they must be taller than any she had ever met. The shape reached the ceiling and seemed to go further, filling the space. There was a vile stench like the fat of rotting meat. Still the shape grew, and in the darkness it looked as though arms were unfolding and beginning to stretch out to her. Not just one pair, but many. 100 sets of arms seemingly reaching in her direction. Priska grasped her axe, prayed to her gods, and thought of her family. There was a thin wisp of smoke as the candle went out.